The parking lot outside Meridian Capital's downtown Toronto office was the kind of place that made certain statements without saying a word. Every vehicle lined up along the front row had been chosen deliberately: blacks, silver, polished, expensive. The kind of cars that cost more than most people's annual salary, and were leased through corporate courts, nobody questioned. Tucked between a gunmetal Mercedes and a silver Audi sat something that did not belong. A 2003 Ford F-150, in faded green, passenger mirror held on with electrical tape, a crack running diagonally across the lower corner of the windshield. Through the back window, visible to anyone who cared to look, sat a child's purple backpack and a worn library book with a rocket ship on the cover. Nobody looked, or rather, the one person who looked long enough to make a decision. Elspeth Vance, managing director of Meridian Capital's Western and Central Canada division, noticed the truck at 8:47 in the morning. She was walking in from her reserved spot near the entrance, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, already 15 minutes, deep into her first call of the day. She paused mid-sentence, looked at the truck, then looked at the security guard stationed near the glass doors. She didn't raise her voice, she never needed to. "Have that removed before 9, she said. Then she continued her call without breaking stride. What Elspeth did not know, what nobody at Meridian Capital knew yet, except for 2 board members who had quietly arranged everything, was that the man who owned that truck had been solving a problem their firm had been bleeding money over for 11 months, and he was already inside. Garrett Munroe had not planned to arrive early. With a 7-year-old, early was a moving target. That morning, his son Owen had woken up at 5:30, with a stomachache that turned out to be nerves about a science presentation at school, not an actual illness, which meant Garrett had spent 40 minutes sitting on the bathroom floor, talking his kid through the difference between butterflies and something genuinely wrong. Braiding Owen's shoelaces through his fingers, while they reviewed the water cycle one more time. By the time he dropped Owen off, he had 12 minutes to spare before his meeting across town. He found parking on the street. The lot was closer, but the signage confused him. Visitor spots weren't clearly marked, so he pulled into the first open space he saw near the entrance, figuring he'd sort it out after checking in. He did not sort it out. When Garrett came back down 40 minutes later to move the truck, it was gone. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment with his hands in the pockets of his jacket. The same dark green canvas jacket he wore most days, because it had good pockets and he'd never gotten around to replacing it, and just stared at the empty space. Not angry yet. Just absorbing it, the way you absorb something that doesn't quite make sense. Like arriving at a dentist appointment and finding the building has changed into a laundromat. Then the reality of it settled in, the way cold water does. Not all at once. One thing at a time. The truck was gone. Owen's backpack was in the truck, his spare insulin kit was in the glove box. Owen had been newly diagnosed 6 months ago, and Garrett kept backups everywhere, an old habit becoming a new compulsion. The meeting was in 22 minutes on the 31st floor. He had no idea where the truck had been taken. He stood there with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that panic is expensive, and he can't afford it. Then he went back inside. The 31st floor of Meridian Capital looked the way money looks when it stops trying to impress you and starts just assuming you already understand. Clean lines, pale wood, art that cost more than the truck. A boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake, which, on a clear November morning like this one, was the kind of view that made people forget what they'd been worrying about. Garrett sat down at one end of the table and opened his laptop. He'd been brought in quietly through a back channel. A recommendation from a former colleague, who now sat on Meridian's risk committee. The firm had spent the better part of a year trying to untangle a structural failure in their commercial real estate underwriting model. 3 separate consulting firms had taken runs at it. One had produced a report so dense and circular that a junior analyst had reportedly printed it out, stared at it for an afternoon, and quietly put in her notice. The losses weren't catastrophic, they were the slow kind. The kind that compound while everyone argues about the methodology. Garrett had been a structural risk analyst for 16 years. He'd spent the last 4 working independently. Mostly because the flexibility meant he could be home when Owen got off the bus. He drove the old truck because it ran, and because replacing it had never once made it onto the top of his list. He set up his presentation with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done something many times and stopped being nervous about it. Around the table, executives filtered in, most of them glanced at him once. His jacket, his lack of tie, the laptop that was a generation behind, and then looked away in the manner of people storing information they haven't yet decided what to do with. Elspeth Vance came in last. She sat at the head of the table, opened her portfolio, and looked up for the first time at the man they'd apparently brought in to do what 3 consulting firms couldn't. Something crossed her face, not quite recognition. More like the beginning of a question she didn't know she was forming yet. She moved on. The meeting began. For the first few minutes, Garrett let them set the stage. He was used to this, the ritual of boardrooms, the way people needed to feel the weight of the problem before they were ready to hear the solution. A senior VP walked through the losses quarter by quarter, a risk manager laid out the failed attempts at correction. A few people shifted in their chairs with the particular discomfort of people who had signed off on those failed attempts. Then they turned to Garrett. He didn't stand up, he didn't start with a slide, he started with a question. Can someone pull up the original model assumptions from Q3 of last year? The version before the first revision. Someone did. Garrett looked at it for about 4 seconds. There, he said quietly, that's the problem. The room went still. He explained it the way someone explains something they've understood for a long time to people who are encountering it for the first time. Not impatiently, but not slowly either. Precise. Clear. He walked through the cascade of errors, not just the surface ones, but the underlying assumption that had seeded all of them. A single misclassification in a risk-weighting table that had been copied forward into every subsequent model without anyone questioning it, because it had been there from the beginning, and things that are there from the beginning tend to get treated as ground. He outlined a correction pathway. 3 phases, 18 months, conservative projections of recovered losses in the range of $31 million over 2 fiscal years. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then someone asked a question, then 3 more came at once. Garrett answered all of them, without checking notes, without pausing to consider, with the particular fluency of someone who has lived inside a problem until it became familiar. Questions about implementation, about regulatory exposure, about the model's behavior under stress scenarios he hadn't mentioned yet. He had answers for those too. The atmosphere in the room had shifted in the way that boardroom atmospheres shift when something real is happening. Less performance, more attention. People who had been half watching the window or checking their phones were no longer doing either. Elspeth had not moved. Her expression was harder to read. She was watching Garrett the way you watch something when you're trying to figure out where you've seen it before. Then one of the board members, a man named Clifford, who had arranged Garrett's involvement and said almost nothing so far, asked the question that changed the temperature of the whole room. What would it take for you to come on exclusively for the duration of this recovery? We'd want to keep you out of reach of the other firms who've been circling this. Garrett looked at him. I'd need to think about the terms. But I'd also need to get going soon. I have to pick up my son from school at 3, and right now I don't actually have a way to get there. Clifford looked at him with a slight smile. What do you mean? My truck was towed this morning, I'm not sure where it went. The room absorbed this. Several people turned, not toward Garrett. Toward Elspeth. Nobody said anything out loud. But the story assembled itself in the room like weather. The truck in the parking lot. The 847 decision. The man now sitting at the end of the table, who had just mapped the recovery of $31 million. Elspeth's face did not collapse. She was too composed for that, but something left it. Some quality of certainty that had been there when she walked in. She looked, for just a moment, like someone doing a calculation that was coming out wrong no matter how many times she ran it. What followed was quiet but not slow. A board member named Suzanne was already on her phone, asking someone to locate the towing company. Clifford was typing something. The VP of operations slipped out of the room without being asked. The whole thing had the quality of people acting quickly, because they needed to, not because anyone had told them to. Garrett watched this with the expression of someone who has learned not to read too much into other people's urgency. He closed his laptop, not dramatically. Just finished. Elspeth stood up from her end of the table and walked toward him. The room, without quite meaning to, gave them a kind of privacy. People finding reasons to look at their phones or speak quietly to each other. She didn't preamble it, that at least, Garrett appreciated. "I ordered your vehicle towed this morning," she said. "Before I knew who you were, that was a mistake in judgment and I'm sorry for it." Garrett looked at her for a moment. He thought, briefly, about the insulin kit in the glove box, about Owen's backpack, about the particular exhaustion of being read wrong before you've opened your mouth, a thing that had happened to him his whole life in certain rooms, and a thing he had never quite stopped noticing even when he'd learned to set it down. "I appreciate that," he said. He meant it, and he also meant that he was done with this part of the conversation. "If someone can help me reach the tow company, that would be useful." The truck came back an hour and 15 minutes later. It had been washed. Garrett hadn't asked for that. It had also been refueled. Someone had taken care of that too, without announcing it. When he walked out of the building with Clifford and 2 other executives who had apparently decided to accompany him to the entrance as if he might otherwise disappear, the F-150 was sitting directly in front of the main doors, clean, green, looking exactly like itself, which is to say, old and dented and entirely unconcerned about that. Owen's backpack was still in the back seat. The library book with the rocket ship was still on top of it. The insulin kit was in the glove box where he'd left it. Garrett checked the kit first, before anything else. Old habit, new compulsion. Then he put the car in gear. Clifford knocked on the passenger window. Garrett rolled it down. "We'll have the contract drafted by end of week," Clifford said. "I'll send it directly." Garrett nodded. "Tell them to include the flexible hours clause. That's not negotiable." Clifford smiled. "Already in." Owen's science presentation had gone well. He announced this approximately 4 seconds after getting into the truck, before his seatbelt was buckled, in the particular tone of a child who has been holding news and can no longer physically contain it. He had explained the water cycle. He had used a diagram he made himself with markers, and a piece of cardboard his dad had found in the recycling. His teacher had said it was the clearest one she'd seen all year. Garrett said that was great. He meant that too. They stopped at a grocery store on the way home, not because they were out of anything critical, but because Owen had been promised that if the presentation went well, he could pick one thing. He picked a box of those orange cream popsicles that come wrapped in pairs, because he thought they should share. He was 7, and he still thought like that, and Garrett was not yet willing to think about the day that changed. In the checkout line, Owen looked at the truck through the window and asked if they were ever going to get a new one. Garrett thought about it. He thought about the contract that would be drafted by end of week. About the retainer that Clifford had described, in terms that still didn't quite feel real. About the thing he'd said when Owen asked, 2 months ago, why their truck made that noise. "Because it belongs to us, and we take care of what belongs to us." "Maybe someday," Garrett said. "Not yet." Owen accepted this with the philosophy of someone who has a popsicle coming and bigger concerns. The contract arrived Thursday. Garrett read it twice at the kitchen table after Owen was in bed, with a cup of tea he kept forgetting to drink. The number on the retainer line was more than he'd made in any single year of his career. The flexible hours clause was there, exactly as promised. He signed it Friday morning, before the school run. 3 weeks after that, he paid off the last of his wife's medical bills. The ones that had accumulated in the 18 months between her diagnosis and the morning he drove to the hospital alone. Because Owen was at his mother's, and there was nobody else to call. And came home to a house that had reorganized itself around absence in the time it took him to make the drive. He didn't tell anyone he'd paid them off. He sat for a while at the kitchen table after the confirmation email came through, and then he put his phone face down and went to check on Owen, who was asleep with one arm hanging off the side of the bed, and his rocket ship library book open on his chest. Garrett set the book on the nightstand, tucked the arm back in, turned off the light. At Meridian Capital, the story didn't stay in the boardroom. It moved the way these things do in office buildings. Quietly but completely, through lunch conversations and team meetings, until it became the kind of story that people used to make a point about something. Elspeth Vance remained managing director. She was good at her job in ways that one bad judgment couldn't fully erase. But in the months after, people noticed something different about how she ran intake meetings, How she asked questions before making calls. How she paused a half-second longer before speaking. Whether she'd truly changed, or simply learned to be more careful, nobody could say for certain. Both are possible. One is more useful than the other. The following spring, Garrett drove the same truck to Meridian's annual Risk Symposium, where he was presenting the results of the recovery model's first full year. He parked in the visitor lot, the clearly marked one this time, though he'd also been offered a reserved spot he'd politely declined. Before he got out, he reached into the Excite and moved Owen's swim bag to the floor so it wouldn't fall. Owen had swim practice after school and Garrett would be heading straight there after the presentation. He grabbed his laptop, walked toward the building. The truck sat in the lot with its cracked windshield and its taped mirror, and the small collection of things visible through the back window. A swims, a reusable grocery tote, a dog-eared copy of a chapter book Owen had abandoned halfway through, and Garrett kept meaning to return to the library. It looked like what it was. A truck that belonged to someone with a full life. That was enough.